If you'll notice, this morning we're going to be having a PowerPoint presentation concerning Revelation. We're going to be focusing on two or three things. Of course, we're not starting the text of the book proper yet. That will be likely next week. I hope we'll be able to get through the PowerPoint this morning. What you're going to be seeing is what I present every semester at Faulkner. I teach a class on Introduction to Critical Studies, and at the very end of the semester, we focus on the book of Revelation. And the material that you're going to be seeing is not original with me. It was a teacher that I had in graduate work a few years ago, and he was gracious enough to allow me to use his material, and I've adapted it somewhat and altered it a little bit. And what you're going to see is a synopsis of what I present in that class, but as it has to do with authorship, dating of the book, and the interpretation of the book, I hope that the things we're going to be looking at will be helpful to you. The author of the book of Revelation identifies himself merely as his servant John. We find that in several places in the book of Revelation. Revelation 1:1, the very beginning of the book. Apocalypsis Jesu Christu, and he goes on to identify himself as Ioanne, John. That's the Greek word for John. He simply identifies himself as his servant John, which is the same as in verse 4 and verse 9 of chapter 1, and again in chapter 22, verse 8. Now, according to Eusebius, who was an early Christian, about 3rd, 4th century, in his church history, Dionysius of Alexandria claimed that the Apostle John could not have written the book of Revelation. Now, we're not going to be looking at the textual reasons why John could have been, because it gets a little bit technical, but suffice it to say, there are many good reasons from the text to say that the apostle wrote the book. There's enough similarities between Revelation and the gospel and the epistles. There are some differences that are, a lot of hay is made by those who doubt or question outright Johannine authorship. But still, I don't think those are sufficient enough to cast a significant doubt on whether John wrote the book. Now, the Allegoi said that the heretic Cerinthus wrote the book of Revelation. This was as reported by Epiphanius in his Panarion that dates back to about the 4th, 5th century. Both Justin Martyr, who is in the 2nd century, AD 160, Irenaeus, AD 180, say that John the Apostle wrote the book of Revelation. Now, Justin Martyr, who wrote about AD 165, said this, and further, there was a certain man with us whose name was John, one of the apostles of Christ, who prophesied by a revelation that was made to him that those who believed in our Christ, notice this, would dwell 1,000 years in Jerusalem. It seems that the premillennial doctrine had an early start among some. Now, as we get to the book of Revelation chapter 20, you're going to see that Jerusalem is nowhere mentioned in Revelation 20. Earthly reign of Christ is nowhere mentioned in Revelation 20, along with a lot of other things. But there were 2 or 3 prominent Christians in the 2nd century who held to this view that Jesus would reign for 1,000 years on earth. But the point of this is he identifies John, the apostle of Christ, as the author. And then Irenaeus, in his Against Heresies, about 180, toward the end of the 2nd century, said, John also, the Lord's disciple, when beholding the holy and glorious advent of his kingdom, says in the Apocalypse, and then he quotes from Revelation 1:12 and 13, as you see depicted here. Except for Dionysius of Alexandria and the heretical Christian group known as the Allegoi, that is a Greek word for irrational. And isn't it ironic that a group that would question the book of Revelation would call themselves the irrational? And those people questioned the book. Except for them, everyone else in antiquity is unanimous that the book of Revelation was written by the Apostle John. But all modern liberal scholars reject apostolic authorship. And should we be surprised by that? I can tell you I'm not at all. I'm not surprised at anything liberal scholars will do or say or write. You're bound to see and hear and read just about anything from liberal biblical scholarship. But they are almost unanimous in saying that John did not write it. Well, there are very good reasons. Aside from the ones that I've just given you, to affirm that John the Apostle was the one who wrote the book of Revelation. Now, to whom was the book written? As you can see from this overview map of the Roman Empire, the first century world was limited by and large in the biblical text to what we know now as Italy, Greece, Turkey, Israel, and Egypt, to a lesser extent. Now, where are the 7 churches of Asia located? They are located in what we know as Turkey, which was then known as Asia Minor, among other ways to put it. The 7 churches of Asia, as you see depicted here, are Ephesus, Smyrna, Pergamum, Thyatira, Sardis, Philadelphia, and Laodicea. When we get into chapters 2 and 3, in the 7 churches of Asia, the letters to the 7 churches, you will see those particular congregations addressed. It was not limited to those 7 churches of Asia. It was intended for all the brethren in that area in the first century. As Brother Tom Holland has once said, you see any congregation, modern day congregation of the Lord's church depicted in Revelation chapters 2 and 3 in the 7 churches of Asia. And it's very, very true to one extent or another, to one degree or another. But those are the churches to whom the book was originally intended. Now, when was this book written? Basically, there are 3 different views. There are as many as 5 views of when Revelation was written, but realistically, there are 3 major views as to when the book of Revelation was penned. Number 1, there is the early date. That is, they say that the book was written sometime late in the reign of Nero, or soon after. That would be prior to AD 70. And then you have, this is a statue, a bust of the Roman Emperor Nero, who reigned from AD 54 to 68. As we know well, he was guilty of persecuting Christians within the city of Rome. As once famously written of him, he doused Christians, many of them in lamp oil, and set them afire in his backyard. Among other horrible things that he did. We'll say more about Nero here in just a moment, but he was, toward the end of his reign at least, a very despicable ruler. Now, Irenaeus says this: "We will not, however, incur the risk of pronouncing positively as to the name of the Antichrist." Now, let me pause here for a moment. This is another example of how premillennialism, or some form of it, was in existence in the 2nd century. The word Antichrist nowhere is found in Revelation. You cannot find that word anywhere. You do find the beast mentioned, the land beast and the sea beast, and people quite often conflate that with the Antichrist, but John in 1 John makes clear who Antichrist is. He says, "You have heard that Antichrist should come, even now there are many Antichrists." He further says that he is Antichrist who denies that Jesus Christ has come in the flesh. We've got many Antichrists today, don't we? We've got people today that say that Jesus Christ is a mythical figure. Well, that's Antichrist. Well, here, Irenaeus is conflating the beast with Antichrist. Here's the point. He says, "For if it were necessary that his name should be distinctly revealed in this present time, it would have been announced by him who beheld the apocalyptic vision. For that was seen no very long time since, but almost in our day towards the end of Domitian's reign." Now keep that quotation in mind. We're going to be coming back to it here in a minute or so concerning the dating of Revelation. Now, the late date is held by many. The early date's held by many. The late date is held by many, which says that the book was written sometime during the reign of Domitian, probably around AD 95. For many years, I, at least publicly, held this position, even though I had reservations about it. I did hold the late date for a long time. I do not hold the early date. I do not believe the early date has sufficient support externally as well as internally. But the late date, even though it seems to have support from Irenaeus, I think there's some question about that, which we will see here in a moment. This is Domitian, a bust of Domitian, who reigned from 81 to 96. From all indications from his contemporaries who survived him after he had passed on, he was a despicable ruler. He was a dictator of the worst sort. As far as whether he conducted an empire-wide persecution of Christians, that is up for question. We don't have evidence that there was an empire-wide persecution of Christians. Now, just because we don't have evidence of it at present doesn't mean it did not happen. But be that as it may, what we do know about Domitian, it should not surprise us if he is identified by John as the beast. And then there's the modified late date, which was promoted by British scholar Henry Barclay Sweet. He says, but it is equally possible that in the vision of the woman and the beast, that is Revelation chapter 17, he, the author, the Apostle John, purposefully transfers himself in thought to the time of Vespasian. He bases that in part on the phrase, the one who now is, from the Greek text, interpreting past events under the form of a prophecy after the manner of apocalyptic writers. He wrote this in 1909 in his commentary on Revelation. Now, what is he saying? He's suggesting that the writer, John, actually wrote late during the reign of Domitian, but pretended to write in the time of Vespasian. Perhaps as a literary device or ploy to throw Roman officials off his scent. Well, I have a problem with deception as it has to do with an apostle. Even if it is to throw Roman officials off, I have a big problem with him intentionally doing this, as we're going to see from the text itself in Revelation 17. The beast which you saw once was, now is not, and will come up out of the abyss and go to destruction. The inhabitants of the earth, whose names have not been written in the book of life from the creation of the world, will be astonished when they see the beast, because he once was, now is not, and yet will come. This here takes a mind having wisdom. The 7 heads are 7 hills on which the woman sits. Now, what are the significance of the 7 hills? Rome was known as the city of 7 hills. You have the Capitoline Hill, which was the smallest of the 7 hills, the seat of administration, the capital of Rome. Then you have the Palatine Hill, the Esquiline Hill, the Quirinal Hill, the Celian Hill, the Aventine Hill, and the Viminal Hill, the city of 7 hills. It is not a coincidence that Paul mentions that in particular in connection here in Revelation chapter 17. He goes on to say, they are also 7 kings. 5 have fallen. 1 is. The other has not yet come, but when he does come, he must abide for a little while. The beast who once was and now is not is an 8th king. Now, what is he saying? If we take his words at face value, he says that there have been 5 kings who have fallen already. They have passed on. 1 is the one who is reigning now as I'm writing this, in other words. The other has not yet come, and when he does come, he must abide for a little while. In other words, he's not going to be reigning that long. Then he says the beast, who once was and now is not, is an 8th king. Now, what does all this mean? Well, you can see this chart of the first Roman emperors, and you probably can't read all of that because of the font size. But there you have listed all 10 emperors that reigned in the first century, from Augustus Caesar all the way to Trajan, who reigned from 98 to 117. Now, if you notice at the top, Julius Caesar was not an emperor. He was a self-limited dictator. He would not have minded being named emperor. But yet the Senate, the Roman Senate, had a big problem with conferring those kinds of powers to him. And as you know, he was stabbed to death by many senators, Brutus among them, on the Ides of March. So Julius was not necessarily the first of the actual Roman Caesars. Augustus was. So you have the Julio-Claudian dynasty from Augustus to Nero. Then you had 3 in between Nero and Vespasian, Galba, Otho, and Vitellius. Then you have the Flavian dynasty, Vespasian, Titus, and Domitian, and then Nerva and Trajan. Well, let's look at these. Augustus reigned from 27 BC to AD 14. He was the emperor in place when Jesus was born. Tiberius from AD 14 to 37, a bust of him here is depicted from the Ephesus Museum in Turkey. He was the emperor in place when Jesus was crucified and when the church began in Jerusalem on the day of Pentecost. Then you have Gaius Caligula, the infamous ruler who was a hedonist. In some ways, he was a good emperor for Rome in the purely political sense, but his personal life and his personal proclivities were very hedonistic. He reigned from 37 to 41. Then you had Claudius, who reigned from AD 41 to 54. His bust here from the Istanbul Museum in Istanbul, Turkey. Then Nero, as we've already mentioned, who reigned from 54 to 68. And the Quinquennium Neronis has to be mentioned here. That is, the first 5 years of Nero's reign, which are known as the Quinquennium Neronis, were marked by a wise and beneficent administration. During this time, he yielded to the advice and influence of Seneca and Burrus, who practically controlled the affairs of the empire and restrained the young prince from exercising his power to the detriment of the state. Under their influence, delation was forbidden, the taxes were reduced, the authority of the Senate was respected. But Nero's worst foes were those of his own household, especially his unscrupulous and ambitious mother, Agrippina. The intrigues of this woman to displace Nero, to elevate Britannicus, the son of Claudius, led to Nero's first domestic tragedy, the poisoning of Britannicus. He afterward yielded himself to the influence of Poppaea Sabina, the most beautiful and the wickedest woman of Rome, and at her suggestion, he murdered first his mother and then his wife. He discarded the counsels of Seneca and Burrus, accepted those of Tigellinus, a man of the worst character. In other words, Nero started out okay because he couldn't do a lot. He was restrained. And that was when Paul wrote Romans chapter 13, let every soul be subject to the higher powers, the powers that be are ordained of God. Well, at that point, Nero had not given himself over to his passions. But then when all that I've just described took place, that's when all of the disaster happened under Nero's reign. So, 5 have fallen, Revelation 17:10 says. I suggest to you those 5 are Augustus, Tiberius, Gaius Caligula, Claudius, and Nero. After Nero's death, the empire was in chaos, with various military leaders vying for the throne. These 3 such men attempted to become emperor, but they lacked sufficient support from the Roman army and from the people. Those are Galba, Otho, and Vitellius from 68 to 69. They fought with each other in their bid for emperor and ended up killing each other. Well, the one who now is, Revelation 17:10. Who is that? The Roman people called for Vespasian, their great military hero. At the time, in AD 69, he was in Palestine with his elder son Titus, leading the Roman army and attacking the city of Jerusalem. Leaving his son Titus in charge of his army, he returned to Rome to accept the throne as the new emperor. And this is a bust of Vespasian, who ruled for a long period of time. In contrast to many of the other emperors, he ruled from 69 to 79 AD. I personally believe that the book of Revelation was written toward the end of Vespasian's reign, likely about 75 to 79, closer probably to 78, 79 AD. That is distinctly a minority view among scholars. I don't care. I think it fits well with Revelation 17 because of what John says explicitly there in that passage. When Vespasian died in AD 79, his elder son Titus came to the throne. Notice, the other has not yet come. That's Titus. But when he does, he must remain for a little while. This is a bust, a statue, that is, of Titus, who reigned from 79 to 81 AD. Notice that John says he must reign for a little while. Titus mysteriously died after reigning only 2 years and 2 months. That's the shortest time for any emperor during the first 2 centuries. And some Roman historians believed that Domitian poisoned his own brother over the throne. What we know about Domitian, that fits him to a T. Because that brings us to who I believe is the beast of Revelation, that is the sea beast, Domitian. He reigned from 81 to 96, and by all accounts was wicked through and through. As bad, if not worse, than Nero. This is another bust of Domitian. We will be looking at this once again here in just a moment or so. And this is another angle of it. So when you look at Revelation 17:11, he says, the beast who once was is an eighth king. Now, I believe that John is referring back to Nero, who once was and now is. He's saying that Domitian, in spirit and character, is as bad or worse than Nero. In fact, there was a myth that circulated the Roman Empire, which might be alluded to in Revelation or might not, called the Nero Revivatus myth. In other words, it said that Nero didn't really die, that he was in exile, he was waiting to come back and take over the empire again. Well, of course, that didn't take place because Nero was dead. But it could be that John is playing off of that when he writes these words in Revelation 17:11. But there's no question in my mind, at least, that Domitian was the beast, that Vespasian was the emperor under whom John was writing the book of Revelation. Now, notice what Irenaeus says about the number of the beast. Those men who saw John face to face, bearing their testimony, the number of the beast, 666. He goes on to say, I do not know how it is that some have erred, deducting the amount of 50 from it. 616. There are some variants in the Greek text that have the number 616 instead of 666. Now, we've all grown up hearing 666, haven't we? Well, did you know that there was another view that it was 616? And Irenaeus questions, I don't know why that has happened. He then says, as we've already seen, we will not, however, incur the risk of pronouncing positively as the name of the Antichrist, he says. He goes on to say, that was seen no very long time since. Notice those highlighted words. That was seen no very long time since, but almost in our day, towards the end of Domitian's reign. Question. When Irenaeus says, for that was seen no very long time since, is he talking about the time when John saw the vision, or the time when the vision came to be fulfilled in the time of Domitian? Most scholars assume that Irenaeus is saying that was seen no very long time since, that is, the vision itself was seen. Well, it was pointed out to me by one of my professors that the Greek text there, when Irenaeus wrote that, can also be interpreted as when the vision was fulfilled. That was seen, that is, the fulfillment of the vision was seen. So that really solidified my thinking, which was already going in the direction of Vespasian date for Revelation. That pretty much solidified it in my mind. I always had a problem with dating Revelation at the latter end of Domitian's reign. If Domitian is the beast, there's not much time for Domitian to do any damage to the church in just maybe 2 years. But if you have it dated during Vespasian's time, where Domitian is yet to come, then you've got all of his reign, 15 years, with which not only to terrorize Romans, but also to persecute the church. So again, there's your chart of the Roman emperors. I believe that is a very significant thing to examine when we're talking about the date of Revelation. He goes on to say, the beast who once was and now is not is an eighth king. He belongs to the seven and goes to destruction. This calls for wisdom, he says in Revelation 13:18. If anyone has insight, let him calculate the number of the beast, for it is a man's number. His number is 666. Now, who is the beast? If you take each letter of Nero Caesar in Hebrew and assign it a numerical value, you come up with the number 666. Neron Caesar, if you want to pronounce it that way. Then Irenaeus, however, as we've seen, said that there were some who deducted the amount of 50 from it, came up with 616. How is that? How do we explain that variant? Well, in the Latin, it is different from the Hebrew. The Latin spelling has no final N. There's no final N in Latin. So when you take off that final N, you come up with 616. That's a simple explanation for it. No really big, significant theological reason. It's just the difference in language. It's talking about the same individual. He's not saying that Nero Caesar is the beast. Remember, the beast who once was and now is. He was like him, but now he's present. He's referring to Domitian being the spirit of Nero. Now, there are some of my brethren who strongly disagree, who hold the early date and say that Nero has to be the beast, or that the Jewish religious system is part of that setup. I do not accept that. We'll talk about that as we go into the book itself. So, there's your difference and the explanation for it. Now, Emperor Domitian, as we've said, reigned from 81 to 96 A.D. The Temple of Domitian in Ephesus is a very fascinating structure to look at. This is a sketch, a brief sketch of what the Temple of Domitian looked like. And we're going to see a more detailed picture of that here in a moment. Huge columns more than 35 feet high supported the 200 by 300 foot podium on which the Temple of Domitian rested. One unusual feature is that these columns had carvings that represented various deities. Apparently, the Ephesians designed the podium this way in order to declare that the emperor, Domitian, was supported by all the world's gods, and that he was the culmination of all deity, the final Lord of heaven and earth, the God of gods. Now, there are those Caesars who were deified after their death. Julius Caesar never once claimed deification for himself, but Domitian was different. Domitian demanded to be addressed as Dominus et Deus, Lord and God. He demanded that. And as you're going to see, it is reflected in the architecture. This is a more elaborate representation of what the Temple of Domitian in Ephesus looked like. Notice that statue right there at the front on the top. Some of that statue still exists today. You saw the bust. You saw the head of the statue. You're going to see something else here in a moment that's going to blow your mind. The Temple of Domitian at Ephesus, the actual site as it appears today, is depicted here. Now, you can't hardly see it, but there are individuals walking in that site. That doesn't really give you a flavor of how big it is. It is a huge site indeed. It is a monument to the ego and to the narcissism, at the very least, of Emperor Domitian. This is another picture. Notice those individuals in the foreground. Notice the individuals in the background. That gives you an idea of the foundation, the size, the scope of the foundation of the Temple of Domitian. That is still there at Ephesus, the remains of it. Now, the statue of Domitian from his temple there at Ephesus, there's one picture of it. You see the bust and the arm, the forearm depicted there. There's a better picture of it. Now, can you tell how big that is? You can't really tell how big that is, can you? The statue is estimated to have been about 27 feet tall. To give you an idea of how big the forearm and the bust is, that's a man who stands about 5'11". Notice how big that arm is. It's about as big as that man. Think about that entire statue when it was still in place. How huge that was. It's a monument to the man's ego. A monument to how he thought of himself. And a monument, too, to how he terrorized the empire. They were happy to see him gone, by the way, when he died. There are many playwrights and poets that wrote extensively about how glad we are that he's no longer with us, because he actually held the Senate as hostage at one point during his reign. Had one professor dismiss all that, saying, it's just all imperial gossip. It's more than imperial gossip. He was a dictator of the worst sort, and I believe firmly that he was the beast, the sea beast of Revelation. Numismatics is the study of coins, ancient coins, and this is a depiction of Domitian on an ancient coin from the first century. Notice on the back how he's depicted as sitting on top of the world. That is his child, if he was going to have a child. He was the one who was divinity. In other words, he is depicted there as godlike. Here's another coin with Minerva, or the sign of Minerva, depicted on the backside of the coin. And yet another, and then another, with another goddess on the backside, and then this, with a temple to his name depicted on the back. Domitian was significantly different in many ways. I believe there's been some things that have been oversaid about Domitian because we don't have the evidence. But what evidence we do have indicates that he fits the bill. If you're going to say that there is a beast of revelation, he really does fit it. And the land beast, tip my hand to you, the land beast would be the emperor cult that enforced emperor worship throughout the Roman Empire. Now, getting into the approaches of interpreting Revelation, there are 5 different major approaches in interpreting Revelation. How do you interpret the book? Well, first, there's what is known as the Preterist Approach. You may not know what preterist means. It's taken from a Latin word which means before the time or as already past. The Preterist Approach says that Revelation was written before AD 70 and that everything in the book happened before the destruction of Jerusalem. Now, Hyper-Preterism says that everything in the New Testament was fulfilled at AD 70, including the resurrection and the second coming of Christ. When I debate Don Preston in July in Oklahoma, that's the proposition he's affirming, which I'm denying. He says that the resurrection, the judgment, the second coming already happened when Titus besieged Jerusalem and destroyed it. That's ludicrous, you say. Yeah, it is. But he has an elaborate system that he argues from, which we're going to try our best to answer. But preterism, as it approaches Revelation, simply says it was written before AD 70, everything in Revelation was fulfilled before AD 70. Then you have the continuous historical approach, and the spiritualist approach, and the premillennial approach, and the recapitulation approach. Now, as we've already said, the preterist approach understands the book to be talking about events that occurred in the 1st century AD. Let me say that the approach to Revelation by the preterists, I can agree with a lot of it, to an extent, to a point. But there comes a point where you part company with them. As they answer premillennialism, I don't have a problem with it. But when they take it too far, as many of them do, I have a huge problem with that. The view is now connected, as we've said, with what has become known as the AD 70 theory, popularized among churches of Christ by Max R. King. I think Max King's still living. I know his son tried to take over the movement that Max King started and was not really successful. Yet Don Preston and others have taken up the mantle of divided churches in many different places over that view. The continuous historical approach is also simply called the historical or historicist approach. This view understands the book to be an overview of church history from the time of the Apostle John until the end of the world, with a special emphasis on the Roman Catholic Church as being the great horde that's mentioned in Revelation 17 and again in chapter 19. Now, this view, exponents typically interpret the 1,260 days of Revelation 11:3, as well as other passages, as the period of the Pope's absolute domination of the world, which had its birth in the decree of Justinian in AD 533 and remained unbroken until the reign of terror during the French Revolution in AD 1793. Now, you see the problem with this approach. This approach applies every symbol to historical circumstances and divorces it completely from the 1st century setting of the book itself. The classic exposition is of E.B. Elliott, and among churches of Christ, the view is popularized by John T. Hines in his commentary on Revelation in the Gospel Advocate Commentary Series. And this is a picture of Brother Hines. His commentary on Revelation is still part of the Gospel Advocate series. Then Harold Luttrell wrote a commentary which he also espoused the continuous historical approach. Published in 1999, Brother Luttrell passed away in 2001. The spiritualist approach, also called the idealist approach, rejects any attempt to identify the images and symbols in the book with any actual persons or events in past history or future prophecy. Well, I've got a problem with that position because obviously these symbols do have relevance in some individuals and some institutions. And Paul or John pronounces a blessing on those who read and understand what this book says. So this view, when taken to its extreme, is simply untenable. This view understands the book merely to depict in imagery and symbolism the timeless spiritual struggle between the forces of Satan and the church throughout all centuries without any special application to a specific period in history. Then you have the view that I completely reject, the premillennial approach. It's called the Futurist Approach, the Chialistic Approach. It is probably the most popular view among those who call themselves Christians, this view understands most of the book to be talking about events that are still future to our present time. They will say the Battle of Armageddon has not happened yet, that it's going to happen literally between the forces of Russia, China, the United States, and so on. And you've heard variations on that view promoted in churches, in movies, and in books. The Omen Series. Have you ever watched the original Omen movie in 1976 with Gregory Peck? You remember that movie when it came out? Well, it made for a very entertaining movie, but yet it was simply false because it promoted this premillennial view concerning the beast and Revelation itself. The terms millennial, premillennial, millennialist, millenarian, millenarianism come from the Latin word mille, 1,000, and the terms kielistic, kielist, kielism come from the Greek word kielia, 1,000, found in Revelation 22 and 3. That's where it comes from, the 1,000-year reign of Revelation 20. Is that a future literal reign of Christ on earth? When we get to Revelation 20, we're going to be talking about that. And there are very, very solid biblical reasons to show why that view is simply not tenable at all. Then there's a recapitulation approach, which is the view of the oldest extant commentary in the book of Revelation of Victorinus, who died in 8303. You can still find an English translation in the Ante-Nicene Fathers series. This view sees the key to understanding the book of Revelation as understanding the visions of the 7 seals in Revelation 6 through 8, the 7 trumpets, 8 through 11, the 7 bowls, 15 and 16, are repetitive and so merely recapitulate the same series of events. This is pretty close to the view that I will be espousing in our series of lessons. This view is popularized by R.C.H. Lenski and by William Hendrickson in More Than Conquerors. Well, that really is what we're talking about. How do you interpret the book? Any interpretation of the book of Revelation which goes against New Testament teaching must be rejected. Premillennialism or hyperpreterism. We've got to make sure that our approach, that our interpretation does not contradict the New Testament in particular and does not contradict the Bible. And as we go through the text, beginning next Sunday, we'll finally get in the text of Revelation. If you have questions, any kind of problems in understanding, all you got to do is this, and I'll call on you, we'll stop and we'll talk about it. And if I don't know the question, I will tell you I don't know the answer to the question. I'm not above saying that because there's a lot of things in Revelation I don't know. But there are some things that I do know. And those things that we can know, we're going to be trying to present as clearly and as logically as we possibly can. So I hope that this has helped to some extent as we enter into the book. That'll help us in understanding of the book itself. Do you have any questions, comments, or snide remarks before we end? A lot of information that I've thrown out. Hopefully we can get the PowerPoint on the website. Yes, sir. Absolutely. I firmly agree with that. It's just like the fellow walking down the street with his friend, and the fellow sees a woman walking down the other side of the street, and he says, "That's your wife." He says, "No, it's not." He said, "That's your wife. The man's never met before." "No, it's not." He said, "That is your wife." He says, "Listen, I don't know who that woman is, but I can tell you who she's not, and she's not my wife." Well, there may be some things I don't know about Revelation, as you're pointing out, but there's one thing I do know: it's not premillennialism. And there's other things that people try to say it is. So I firmly agree with you. Some of these symbols, even though we may not know what they are, we can know what they're not. And just knowing that goes a long way in our help in understanding the book. All right, our time is gone. Thank you very much.